When I start playing a multiplayer game, 4 questions are going to be answered, even if I'm not immediately aware of these questions. And these questions really deeply affect the way the game is designed and potentially my engagement with that game. Those 4 questions are: whose character am I playing? Whose progress am I making? Whose story am I playing in? And whose world am I playing in? Each of these questions essentially has 4 potential answers: mine, yours, ours, or sort of a everyone's/no one's. When we're talking about whose character, we're talking about the character that I am controlling in the course of the game. If the answer is mine, that means I am taking a character that is controlled by me and I'm using it in this game directly. You sometimes have a sort of asterisk version of mine in this case, where maybe I have a character that I control that is limited to being used within the multiplayer sessions. Mass Effect multiplayer basically is like this. You have your shepherd, and then you have a different character that you're using, or different characters that you're using in Mass Effect multiplayer. So that's kind of a mine with an asterisk. Yours means that I am using one of the characters in the game that I am joining. I am taking possession of them. I don't have direct control of this character, or I have limited control. It is owned by the person who I'm playing with. Ours is a weird one in the case of the character. There's a communal pool of characters that we're sharing, or there is some way that we're all controlling the same character simultaneously. Some interesting opportunities to explore there. Don't really see ours when it comes to character very often. And then everyone, no one's, that means there really basically isn't a character. If there's any sort of character at all, then likely you aren't getting this. There's probably some sort of ownership beyond it just being a pool of everyone in the world sharing the same character. But if there's no character at all, you're playing multiplayer Tetris, then the answer is basically no one. Why do I care? Well, as a player, I care because I get emotionally engaged in my character. So if you're asking me to play your character, you're asking me to lose a lot of that emotional engagement. If the answer is closer to ours, then I feel like I'm losing some control because we're sharing a character. Either of us can level it up or modify the way that it exists, potentially without my consent, which I may not enjoy as a player. If you go for that mine with an asterisk where you're playing a special character, that helps. The character belongs to me, but it's not the character that I invested all of my effort and work into. So it's not as strong of an attachment as I would get otherwise. For the devs, it also matters quite a bit. If I give you that character, let you bring your own character into the game, then potentially I have 2 protagonists running around. And if the protagonist is some sort of chosen one, now the story doesn't really make a ton of sense. Related to whose character is whose progress am I making? Now, if it's my character, you ideally want it to be my progress as well, but that can lead to problems of balance. So if I'm bringing my main character into your game, you may not want me to take back all of the loot that I picked up because there might be exploits that are too easily abused in that case. In which case you kind of get a mine asterisk again, where I'm getting a reward for joining your game, but it is less than what I would get by playing in the single player version of the game, or it's different at least. Or again, maybe I'm using that mine asterisk character, in which case the progress is limited to that character. Yours might mean that I don't get a reward at all. It might be my character joining your game. Maybe I don't get a reward at all. You get the reward of all the loot and the progress. I don't really get anything at all. Or if I'm taking possession of your character, then there's not really any way for the progress to be mine. So in that case, the reward is going to you as well. Ours just means that we are sharing the progress. And then everyone/no one, maybe there's no particular progress being built up here. Maybe there's a counter of how many Geth have been killed that's being kept for the entire community. So the progress is being built and shared by the entire community as a whole. There are a lot of players whose primary motivation of playing the game is progression. If all the progression is yours when I join your multiplayer game, then the attachment, the draw of multiplayer for me as someone driven by progression goes really down, potentially goes away completely. But if we give you all the progression when you go into a game, then there are huge exploit holes potentially available in the game. Things that players will do that might undermine their enjoyment of the game. If I can join your game at level 1 and take back all this level 50 gear with me that I can immediately use, I trivialize my experience of the game, potentially. I do feel that with progression, there are lots of opportunities to look for alternative forms of reward for multiplayer, however. You don't necessarily have to have all of the gear flowing back for there to be progression that is worth it for someone to engage with, even if they're quite driven by progression. You can give other forms of reward that affect their experience in their game and still get that benefit. Progression that happens at a community level, where you are keeping track of the number of Geth that were killed, or you are allowing the community as a whole to have an impact on all of their experiences, is also really interesting and gives opportunities for the community to come together as a group and really engage in the multiplayer experience. Whose story is interesting because it can result in very different and weird design decisions. If I am in a multiplayer game and the story is mine, then that means presumably your story is yours and that other person's story is theirs, but we're all playing together in some way. So how are we experiencing different stories at the same time? What is the mechanism for that? One thing you'd see that's kind of in that partial mine answer is what you see in games like Destiny, where I can preemptively get story progress by playing a mission that I haven't yet reached in my version of the game. I can check it off, and then when I reach it through normal progression, then I've already seen it. I've already made that story progress. So I can turn an experience of your story into my story retroactively. Yours means that I am coming into your story, experiencing your story for as long as I'm there. It is making no progress in my own experience. When I leave your game, everything I saw is like a dream that is undone by that process. In this case, ours is the idea that we are experiencing the story as a group. That means that potentially we are progressing the story simultaneously in multiple ways if we're not currently playing together. Maybe it means that we are sharing an overarching goal, but we are approaching it and reaching that goal through multiple different ways simultaneously. Everyone or no one's means the story is backed up. We are experiencing the story more statically in the case of that, because either we are progressing story as a giant community, or more likely the story is moving at a regular cadence forward and we are experiencing the story as dictated by the developers. If I am playing multiplayer, I want my story to have some degree of continuity. This needs to be considered fairly carefully, because if I'm going into your game and playing with you and the story is completely spoiled by that experience, then that undermines the story experience for my playthrough. Now, you could argue that, well, you could just wait until you finished the game in the first place, but there are people out there who want to have a social storytelling experience, who want to experience the story the first time with other people. This is what campaign co-op is all about, is the idea of experiencing the story together. But to do that, you either need to go and push it right to one extreme of yours, and then it's all a social contract where we've chosen to experience the story together, or you need to look at ways where I can join your game and not undermine my story experience in the process. But if I just provide no story context and no story progression when I join your game, then you potentially undermine the motivation of playing with you, because I'm joining an experience, a campaign, a mission, and I don't understand what's going on, And then when I go back to my game and run into that mission, I don't have the ability to skip that mission, and I'm potentially just chewing that same content several times that I've already experienced once before in a multiplayer match. In the case of these multiplayer modes that are adjacent to the primary story, there needs to probably still be some form of story. In this case, you're kind of moving typically into that everyone or no one story where the world is relatively static. You are doing something that makes sense, that you are repeating it. There, again, you need to consider that. What is something that the players will accept doing over and over again that will make enough sense for them to engage with long term? Finally, whose world am I in? When it comes to whose world, it's really about how much change can I make in the world. If it's my world and I blew up that castle over there and you didn't, I see the castle blown up, you see the original castle simultaneously in the game. If it's ours, we are sharing this experience. If you blew up that castle and it's our world, I see the castle being blown up because you blew it up. It's our world. In the everyone case, usually the world is relatively static because the entire community is experiencing it. So it can't change very much. It can only change on a very specific cadence to keep everyone in sync. Obviously, the easiest one of these for world is to have a relatively static world, but players like to have an impact upon the world that they're playing in. If you can, it's interesting to try to explore experiences to pull in a mine or an hours as your answer to this question. Because if I can potentially be playing with you and we are experiencing the world in two different states simultaneously, and you can make that make sense, then that means that I feel like I continue in my game, you feel like you continue in your game, and we are able to play together and then bounce apart without undermining the integrity of either of our experiences. If the answer is yours, then I run the risk of coming into your world and getting a massive spoiler because the tower from the beginning of the game is exploded and I haven't reached that part of the game, and I'm looking at that and seeing that and wondering what in the world is going on here. You need to consider the impact upon the players as you go to answer these questions. These questions are really the start of the process of figuring out how your multiplayer storytelling are going to work. There are tons of nuances and asterisks and different ways to approach these. But if you don't think about these questions when you're developing your multiplayer storytelling, you kind of end up in a bit of a mishmash. So let's look at a few examples. A game like Baldur's Gate, which has full campaign co-op, gets that co-op by the most expedient way possible, which is literally just making the answer to all of these questions yours. When I join a multiplayer game in Baldur's Gate, I am clearly joining your game. You made these characters. This is your story. This is your world. The progress all lives with you. We can kind of reach an agreement amongst ourselves and turn that yours into ours because maybe we agree that you don't play unless I'm playing with you, and that I'm allowed to choose how we level up the characters that you created, and maybe I provided input in how they were created, and we share choices in terms of how the story advances. But architecturally, Baldur's Gate's answer to this question is yours across the board. That's the simplest answer, is to just say, when I join somebody else's game, it is very clear that I am joining someone else's game, and all answers are in service of not disturbing the integrity of the person whose game I am joining. This has problems because for a lot of people, it may not be clear why they would even want to play multiplayer in this case. They don't get any progress. They're not advancing their own story. They are not able to be in control of what's going on. They might be like, why didn't I just play my own single player game? And that's a legitimate question. But this does allow you to introduce the concept of group storytelling without actually having to deal with a lot of the additional complexity of the problem set. Most MMOs go this way. The character is mine. The progress, mine. The story, sort of mine. Mostly mine. Sometimes I'm experiencing bits of other people's story, but mostly I'm experiencing my story. The world is everyone's. There is no progress being made by the things that I do in the world. I'm not changing the world in a dramatic way, really at all, because the world needs to stay roughly the same for everyone. In order to allow the story to be mine in an MMO, you typically have to limit the impact of what that character is doing, or at least pretend like it has a bigger impact than it truly does, because either what I'm doing isn't changing the world, or it's changing the world in such a way that the other players wouldn't notice it. If I am going and killing a raid boss, which is saving this entire region from everlasting darkness, that can't actually really change anything because 17 other players are lined up to do the same thing, kill that guy again. So in an MMO, there's always this implicit status quo to the world state because we all kind of have to exist in the world at the same time. Some games like Final Fantasy XIV do a really good job of making it seem and feel like the things that I'm doing are incredibly impactful to the continued existence of the world, even while there are hundreds of other people around me doing exactly the same thing at the same time. In Mass Effect 3 multiplayer, the character is that mine asterisk, not Shepard. I'm a different character that I am playing and advancing and progressing. You might even argue that because the character is pretty fixed, that really it's a sack of progression more than it is a character. I think that's a little unfair, but you could make that argument. Progression, clearly mine. Story is kind of an everyone's perspective. We are playing through story, but the story, because we're repeating missions over and over again, is a relatively static thing that we are experiencing over and over. We're not really changing anything by what we do and what we act. The world, similarly static. We're playing the same missions, the same spaces over and over and not impacting those spaces. Mass 3 multiplayer did occasionally do community challenges, which then fed back into the overall world building and storytelling. So you could say that that is sort of a form of everyone progress, where we are recording the progress of everyone in order to accumulate this as a group. And then that is also causing a form of everyone's storytelling in everyone's world. But the scope of that was relatively limited. In Elden Ring, this is really heavily leaning into yours. When I join someone to help them with a boss, I am joining their game. I am using my character, however. It is your game, your story, your world, with my character, and then I am given some degree of progression that I take back. I'm giving a reward. So it's not directly the same reward as I would get by killing this boss on my own, but it's still something that I find valuable. But because Elden Ring limits the scope of your multiplayer engagement somewhat, you don't have to worry as much about the answers to story and world, because I'm sort of popping in, doing something quick, and then popping back out again. So the integrity of my experience isn't really damaged by that engagement. Death Stranding is an interesting thing to think about through this lens. It's a single player game, basically. So character is mine, progress is mine, the story is mine, and yet, because of the way that it builds out everything in the world is ours. The world is evolving and changing based upon the actions of the other people playing the game, which is really interesting. Journey similarly pulls a magic trick because character is mine, though doesn't change very much. The story feels like mine, the world feels like mine, but then when I bump into another character in the world as I'm playing, suddenly for a little while, it feels like the story and the world becomes ours. It's a beautiful magic trick that Journey pulls off. The reason that this video even exists is because I needed to get this out into the world before we got to Anthem. When Dylan, the game that eventually became Anthem, was originally conceived, the initial presentation of this was the idea that the answer to these questions would be ours, that I would have my character, but the progression and story and world would be ours, that we would be in this shared communal storytelling space. Now, I don't know that it was ever clearly understood what that meant or how it was going to be done. These are questions that weren't being asked, but you can glean that and pick it out of the initial presentation material for Dylan. But as Dylan became Anthem, direction on a lot of this got a little bit lost. So character is clearly mine, progression clearly mine, story kind of mine, kind of yours, kind of ours, and that's a problem. Because that crispness of answer is missing, you get problems where people are dragging people through missions that they've never experienced before and undermining and damaging their storytelling experience. The world ends up being much more static than was intended because this question wasn't addressed in a way to be more dynamic. So what you end up with in Anthem is, it's my character, it's my progression, it's sort of my story, but it's very easily damaged by people in the story with me, pulling me along in ways that undermine my experience. And the world is pretty static, thus resulting in it kind of being no one's world. And this is why you need to ask these questions, because that storytelling question is the one that Anthem does the poorest job of answering. As a result, has this partial answer, but hasn't considered the consequences of its answer and hasn't put the guardrails in place to maintain the integrity of that experience for people who are playing it for the story. There's one answer set that I feel is often discounted by game devs, but actually gives you a fairly interesting multiplayer experience. If you simply answer yours to every single one of the questions, then what you have is something where the implementation and dev side of the experience is actually relatively easy. Because the answer to every single dev question when it comes to the impact of your multiplayer mode is, we make no compromises. So if it is your character, I am taking possession of someone in someone else's game. If it is your progression, I bring nothing back with me into my game. If it is your story, we play through the story that you are experiencing. Likely you prevent me as the person joining your game from advancing the story at all. So the integrity entirely exists within the player whose game that this is. If it is your world, similarly, I have no impact upon the world. The world exists from the perspective of what you, the game owner, is experiencing. This is limited because it means that people who are driven by progression have little reason to play a game like this. It means that probably there needs to be a social contract in place between the people playing together to allow there to be some engagement by the people joining in the experience that is occurring. But there are people for whom this is enough. This is a multiplayer experience that gives them the opportunity to play a story game together, experience the story together. And while yes, there is someone who's in charge, maybe that's all they are looking for. And you don't necessarily have to make any compromises. You make no compromises to the writing. The writing is always written from the point of view of a single protagonist, and everyone speaks to that protagonist as the most important person. Everyone else is simply a follower. Indeed, maybe you are simply possessing a follower, and you make no compromises there. And if a romance occurs and that's super weird, that's what you do. You can take a very hard line and simply say, it is yours across the board. We make zero compromises to this experience. And know that for some people, that would be more than enough for them to be able to experience the multiplayer game that they are looking for. But as soon as you start changing any of those answers from yours to any of the other answers, other than possibly simply none or static, then you open up a cascading series of design questions. If I change the answer to whose character from yours to mine, well, now I have someone in the story who doesn't really belong there. Are they the protagonist? Or are they sort of a pseudo-protagonist? How does the rest of the game respond to them? Do they have agency in the storytelling? When I start to try to move story off of yours to a different answer, now I'm making compromises in the single player writing in order to try to handle the fact that there are people at different places in the game together at the same time experiencing a story that is the same or slightly different or something. On the storytelling side, as soon as I move off of yours, then I need to start asking questions around shitty mentor and people undermining my story experience when we're playing together. With yours, you can take a really hard line and say, only this one person is allowed to do anything with the story. It's only once I start to try to have a more balanced approach that I cascade out all of these other potential answers that then lead to other questions. If I am allowing progression to move back and forth between different games, I'm introducing problems with balancing, different problems with potentially undermining someone's experience by giving them gear that trivializes the game as a whole. If we are experiencing different forms of the world at the same time, then there's a lot of questions that then cascade back. So I think it's often dismissed as an answer set, just yours, hardline across the board, but I don't think it should necessarily be dismissed outright. Now, obviously, if you're trying to make a looter shooter, you can't go with yours because progression is non-existent for the people playing in someone else's game. But for other more traditional storytelling genres, I do think there's an opportunity to introduce multiplayer to these people in a way that is relatively easy from the design side by simply just not compromising anything from the single player side. I've had this discussion with people over the years, and it is a hard one to get people to fully grasp, I feel. When you are making a game that is going to have storytelling, ask these questions to at least think about the implications of the different potential answers. You can make good games that answer these questions in literally any way. And I think there are some really interesting games potentially to be made by throwing an hours as the answer to one of these questions that you wouldn't expect. Think about them. Think about your answers. Think about the implications of those answers. Use these questions as a starting point for multiplayer storytelling. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have merch. This is high tea on the high seas. If you're interested in that, there's a shelf below the video as well. What are some interesting answers to these questions that you've seen in games that you've played? What's an interesting answer that you haven't seen but would love to explore? Let me know that down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up because that helps YouTube know that it's worth spreading to other viewers. I will see you again soon. Thank you.